Stories from Vietnam continued to develop decades after the U.S.'s involvement in what became a protracted conflict. These are the stories of those who survived the Vietnam War, and of the families of those killed in action and were left with grief and questions. Dave Kovac of Morgantown, West Virginia, enlisted in the Marine Corps after graduating from high school at 17, volunteering to go to Vietnam. He was killed in 1965 during an ambush in a rice paddy. His sister, Mary Minnis of Adamstown, has worked in the intervening years to keep her brother's memory alive.
After Dave died, a lot of his friends, some of them actually joined and went over because of his death. They just wanted to bring honor to him and to also do their part. So it was just a long, hard time being without him and realizing that he would forever be 19 and that the rest of us had to go on. It was so devastating to my father that as the news was full of Vietnam in the years following Dave's death, as young children, if we had the TV on and Dad was coming home from work, we knew we had to turn that TV off before he even walked in the door because it was just too hard on him to hear it all. It was still too early, I think, in the war for us to have faced that, what happened later when people returned. And I didn't know that many that returned that came home alive, so we weren't facing in our town a lack of respect to those who might come home.
In 1968, Adamstown resident Lorraine House joined the Army Nurse Corps and volunteered to go to Vietnam rather than to Walter Reed, where she had originally been assigned. A week after she arrived in Chu Lai, a mortar attack killed a nurse in a nearby unit, the only American nurse to be killed by enemy fire during the war.
The drill was that when the siren went off, you immediately put on your helmet and your flak jacket, and of course if we were in surgery, we just kept doing surgery. I mean, that was, you didn't run into a bunker or hunker down or anything.
House's duties in the operating room had her treating not just American servicemen, but also South Vietnamese and prisoners of war. And although the barrages became less frequent for a while, the danger roared back at the end of her deployment.
The last month I was there, of April of '70, we were hit just about every night. We had lots of incoming.
Once she was back stateside, House was warned of the potential for hostility toward those in uniform.
They would tell us when we came to work that we could wear civilian clothes to work and then change into uniform when we got to work because of the potential for harassment.
Stephen Smith, who served in the U.S. Army's 1st Infantry Division, felt as if his generation of servicemen was treated as if they didn't exist upon their return.
We were the veterans that fought no war, won no medals, won no combat. We were an embarrassment to America. And that's just the way I think we felt when we came back. And I think we were treated that way also.
As unpopular as the Vietnam War was, many service members felt disaffected when they came home, finding comradeship after joining veteran service organizations such as the American Legion. Bob Wyatt, who was under fire nearly every day during his tour as a Navy Seabee in 1968 and 69, is emblematic of the many veterans who returned with profound emotional scars. Post-traumatic stress disorder, an affliction Wyatt struggled with silently for years, was induced by what he calls soul wounds.
The idea that, I deeply believe that I could have friends I could walk down the street with and not worry about having one of them blow up, or I could be talking to somebody and that person isn't going to have their head cut off, within seconds.
It wasn't until 2007, when Wyatt had just accepted an award for advocacy work he was doing for other veterans, that someone with the Veterans Administration asked Wyatt when he was going to address his own issues.
As soon as they all left, I asked the social worker that worked for us, and he just looked at me and said, "Everybody knows you have PTSD, Bob."
But PTSD wasn't the only affliction that went unacknowledged for decades after the war. Agent Orange, which was tested at Fort Detrick prior to the war, is an herbicide that was sprayed from U.S. aircraft in an attempt to diminish the enemy's ability to stealthily move men and supplies through the dense jungle. About 20 years passed before the Department of Veterans Affairs would recognize some of the conditions caused by exposure to Agent Orange. John Kraft stood in puddles of the chemical on a tarmac in Vietnam while serving as a mechanic in the Air Force in 1969.
It wasn't until later when things started going wrong that you realized it wasn't okay.
In 1988, Kraft was diagnosed with early onset Parkinson's disease. This was almost a decade after he received a letter from the VA dismissing his worries of exposure to Agent Orange, calling them, quote, irrelevant.
I mean, I didn't ask for anything. I didn't draft it, I enlisted. It could have been something else too. I could have been hit by an airplane, I could have been shot. So I just accepted it best I could.
A lack of acceptance of service members during the Vietnam era made their transition home all the more challenging.
I am so sad that a lot of people don't understand what a veteran really does and what he did. It's a hurt that I don't think will ever go away, especially for a Vietnam veteran.
The hope for education that so many Vietnam veterans desire is one of the reasons people like Patty Redmond take part in the Library of Congress's Veterans History Project, which facilitates the documentation and preservation of individual service members' experiences. Redmond, who interviewed the sailor and nurse portrayed in the famous kissing sailor picture from Times Square on VJ Day, also interviewed her husband Robert, who was a Green Beret in the U.S. Army during Vietnam.
Years later, when I started doing the interviews, I said, well, I'd like to interview you. And he said, well, I'll give you my story someday.
Before he died of cancer, a known result of Agent Orange exposure, Robert allowed his wife to document his story, recorded bedside in the hospital on cassette tape.
It wasn't their fault that they were there. They did what their government told them to do. But the public took it out on them. I guess the hardest part is to get the veteran to open up. Some people, most of the World War II and the Vietnam veterans have never told their stories before. And so if we can just get the individual to talk, they all have stories. And they're all heroes, regardless of whether they say they're not and they did nothing.
Looking back at the personal items sent home after Dave Kovac was killed in Vietnam, his sister Mary cherishes a handwritten letter Dave carried with him until the day he died.
But there was an envelope, and it had in it a little black, very small little New Testament that one of his high school buddies had given to him. That was one of the things that he must have carried with him wherever he went. When it came back, inside was a little handwritten note that I later typed up. It was a Dear Mom and Dad letter, and it really meant the world to us. To Mom and Dad, if I die here, my wish would be that you wouldn't cry. Yet in realizing that you will, and grasping your sorrow, I'll understand, because I too hold the same deep love for you as I know you do for me. For I am your son, and you are my parents. Yet you must be strong, because for you to have less sorrow will increase my happiness. Feel not that my life was nipped at the bud of its blooming, but rather that God saw fit to bring to close the efforts of a young man for some reason unknown to us. And surely that reason must be for the ultimate